So I guess what I'm really interested in talking about is how the Nazis used law to underpin some of the terrible crimes that were committed during the Holocaust. And we see that the Nazis used ideology and beliefs pertaining to racial purity. And these shaped very persuasive narratives and subsequently policies and laws which facilitated, as we see here, unprecedented acts of genocide. And this does beg the question, why are narratives so important? And I guess they help us explain why the German citizens responded to the victims of the Holocaust with such hatred and hostility. And the narratives that underpin some of the laws that I'm going to be talking about today are extremely pervasive. What we have to understand is that they're being deployed in all manners of medium throughout Germany at the time. So these narratives sort of crop up in propaganda news reels. In newspapers. A very famous example, of course, is the anti-Semitic newspaper Die Stürmer. And we see here this rather strange picture of this little boy looking in at the Stürmenkasten, which probably isn't very German. You'll have to excuse my poor German. But it's basically a public newsstand, and he's reading this anti-Semitic newspaper. But the narratives are also circulated in children's storybooks. Posters and public notices. So what we need to understand is that the laws that I'll be discussing subsequently are shored up by these narratives that are getting told throughout German society. And they tap into, of course, a very long and rich history of anti-Semitism that had existed in Germany for quite a long time. And so one particular narrative I want to explore, because it crops up when we see some of the laws later, is this idea of the narrative of racial cleanliness and purity. And it introduces the notion of the diseased and dirty Jew.
The Jew is instinctively interested in everything abnormal and depraved. He seeks possibilities of disrupting a people's healthy judgment. The Jew Peter Lorre, in the role of a child murderer, with the notion that not the murderer but his victim is guilty. Normal judgment is twisted by a sympathetic portrayal of the criminal to gloss over and excuse the crime.
And the famous historian Goldhagen speaks of this idea quite succinctly. He talks about a universality of belief which prevailed in Germany in the 1930s onwards. The Jews were racially impure and the source of all of Germany's woes. Of course, this is a nonsense, but nevertheless, this is the idea that was circulating at the time. And this narrative is deeply entrenched in the national psyche, and as we will see, it informs some of the laws that were shaped by the Nazis. And so much in the same way, I guess, that you control an epidemic by isolating and removing the source of an infection, the concept of a quarantine, the Nazis believed that making Germany Jew-free would allow the Aryan population to flourish. And this, in a way, is linked to the idea that Jews live parasitically off honest working-class German labour, which of course is also a nonsense, but was a very powerful idea circulating in Germany at the time. Now we have to understand that the Germans were very obsessed with the rule of law. They really had a lot of respect for law. They thought law was very important. And we see this interesting anecdote here where Hermann Goering had suggested in the course of discussing this idea that German travellers should just kick Jewish passengers off a crowded compartment on a train. And in a private discussion with Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, Goebbels replied, "I would not say that. I do not believe in this. There has to be a law." So the Germans were really interested in the idea of respecting the rule of law, and it's partly why they paid so much attention to law to further the Holocaust. Now, there's a range of some 1,000 odd anti-Jewish decrees that were passed between 1933 and 1945. I'm not going to read them all out because you can read them there on the screen yourselves, but I will draw your attention to a few of them. And some of them are quite obscure. Look at this one here, the third one down, 1933. The Reich Interior Ministry decree forbidding the listing of Jewish holidays on office calendars. It's quite an unusual law, rendering a holiday invisible on a calendar. And some would say, well, that one's not so important, and perhaps it isn't in isolation. But if you look at some of the other laws here, you'll see they're actually very significant. Jewish students excluded from exams in medicine, dentistry, pharmacy and law, even though they might have studied for many years. Kosher food rituals being outlawed. Jewish doctors and dentists being banned from participating in state health insurance schemes. And this rather insidious law in 1933 with the law for the restoration of the professional public service, which was basically aimed at removing Jewish people from the public service. And the day after that law was proclaimed, 5,000 public servants were immediately sacked because they were Jewish. A very important law that we have to acknowledge today is the Reich Citizenship Law of 1935. Now, this law effectively delimited citizenship to people of German and related blood. And Jews and other non-Germans were reclassified as aliens and denied citizenship. So overnight, after this law was passed, someone who might have lived in Germany all their life was technically rendered, if they were Jewish, an alien, a non-citizen. That's a very important concept. And as a result of this, they were immediately stripped of various rights to vote in elections or hold public office. As I said, there's such an enormous variety of laws to get through, and I'm only touching upon some of them. They're quite interesting. Jews banned from playing in public orchestras. Jews banned from owning theatres and large department stores. Jews no longer allowed to purchase electrical, optical equipment, bicycles, etc. Jews forbidden to attend public schools and universities. We see, I guess, as time goes by, a gradual ratcheting up of these laws in terms of the severity and the scope of public life that they covered. Now, here's a very interesting image of a sign. This sign declares that this is the first Jew-free beach in the North Sea resort of Durham in the 1930s. And they went to the trouble of designing this sign and putting it on the beach. And it relates back to this earlier idea I was talking about the narrative of racial purity. And here you have this idealised vision of a German woman, and she's not Jewish. This sign is sending a message to the people that you can enjoy this beach and it's Jew-free. You're not going to be troubled by their presence in any way, shape or form. As I said, there's just so many of these laws to discuss. It's quite interesting. Look at this one, 1938. All Jewish street names changed to German names. Somewhat similar to the law rendering the holidays invisible on the calendar. Jews banned from driving motor cars, and the official explanation of this law was their presence on the road offended the German traffic community. Jews not lawfully permitted in Aryan insane asylums. So the Jewish people in asylums were literally just turfed out onto the street overnight. Jews banned from flying the national flag, the logic being there that they're not worthy of flying the flag because they're not German citizens. And even, this rather obscure one at the bottom, the sale of Jewish newspapers in the street was prohibited. I think this is quite a powerful image. This is, of course, from Yad Vashem, and it depicts a bench in a Berlin park for Aryans only. And what's interesting here is we can see that some of the laws that I'm discussing, they're not just kind of decrees that get proclaimed and no one sort of takes any notice of them. Basically, Jews were forbidden from entering parks public parks in Germany, and this image here is basically saying, unless you're a German citizen, you can't bother to take some rest and sit down on this seat. And if you were, in fact, a Jewish person who dared to sit on this seat, you might have found yourself arrested or beaten up or treated very savagely for disobeying the decree. This list and it's very selective. I could go on all day. There's a good 1,000 or so laws. Jews forbidden to use public telephones. Jews banned from using public libraries. So you can't even go to the library to borrow a book. Jews prohibited from owning pets. Think about how malicious that one is. You might have a pet cat or a dog. I'm not sure what the particular logic was behind that law, but it's quite a passive-aggressive sort of concept. Jews prohibited from having their hair cut by Aryan barbers. Now, I kept talking about this idea of racial purity. This one relates to that idea because the logic was cutting their hair with the scissors could pass on diseases, etc. Jews prohibited from receiving the Reich Sport Badge, 1942. So even if you perform well in some sort of sporting carnival, you couldn't receive a medal.
I would have been a loser either way. Because had I won, that would have been such an insult against the German psyche. How can a Jew be good enough to win the Olympics? That I would have had to be afraid for my life, I'm sure. And had I lost, I would have been made as a joke.
All use of public transport is prohibited to Jews around 1942, and Jews were not allowed to receive deliveries of egg or milk. Blind and deaf Jews no longer allowed to wear armbands identifying their condition in public. Once again, there's something really quite malicious about this idea that a blind person or a deaf person can't be identified because that places them more at risk of being hit by a car or suffering some sort of injury. But you have to understand the Nazis wouldn't have cared if that occurred, hence why they changed the law. They weren't interested in protecting these people from harm. And of course, as we all know rather famously, by decree, Jews were made to display yellow stars of David in public and carry identity cards. And people who flouted this law and didn't obey it ran the risk of being immediately arrested and sent off to a concentration camp. And the law was also used to seize property from German banks, etc., because the logic was that it was deemed lawful. And perhaps I'll touch upon that one in a bit more detail here. The Germans were absolutely obsessed with detail. So the example I've got here is theft of Jewish property. The Nazis knew that they simply couldn't sort of march in and take or seize Jewish property because that would be stealing. And as we all know, stealing is a criminal offence and that would be punishable by law. So they set up the logic that they were going to, and I quote, seize the property, and they said that the seizure of the property would be justifiable because the property had been obtained at the expense of the German people. So forms were used to bureaucratise this process of theft. Meticulous attention was paid to getting the spelling of names and the details of the property to get it correct. Forms had to be properly stamped in an office. Forms had to be filled out in triplicate using carbon paper. One copy was given to the owner and the other two filed in the government office. So using this scheme, you'd be sitting at home one morning having breakfast and there'd be a knock on your door and the German would serve you with a piece of paper and basically say, get out of the apartment's not yours. And you'd be thrown out onto the street rather unceremoniously immediately. And all the property that was in there, be it silverware, fine china, etc., could be confiscated by the state. I saw this image when I was at Auschwitz a few years ago, and I thought it was quite powerful because you see this figure of justice, and justice is usually depicted in the manner of a gendered figure that is female, and yet this image, even though that appears to be addressed, it's quite a masculine sort of looking face to me. But nevertheless, you see in this image the figure of justice hounding this Jewish figure, and he is typically, of course, depicted with exaggerated grotesque features, etc. The logic here is quite simple. The law is taking care of the Jewish problem and he's shirking from this figure of justice. So I guess I've talked about a whole sort of range of different laws here, and an important question is what might we make of these laws in their totality? That is, one law piled upon another. And I guess what I would draw your attention to is the idea that they effectively, in their totality, remove basic civil rights, such that the Jew, living in Nazi Germany, was imagined as having no rightful place in German society. So you can't be in a public park, you can't be frequenting a cinema, you can't get your hair cut at a barber, etc., etc. In their totality, there's no fear of public life that isn't covered by these laws. So one can see, I think, in the laws not only a symbolic but an actual desire to render the Jew invisible in every facet of civil life. And if you think about the logic of rendering people invisible, it's not too far a jump to understand why you then might want to go further, take them east to the concentration camps of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, etc., and exterminate them. And I think it's a very powerful point. You can see, and it's retrospectively, I don't think at the time this is necessarily possible, that these laws produced a civil death for the various people that they affected that precede the actual murders in the camps. And I think that's a fairly important point. And my final slide I want to sort of dwell on is this, because some people would sort of say the Nazis really didn't need law to perpetrate the Holocaust. And I think the paradox is that that's pretty well true. Despite the fact there was a lot of law, I'm not really arguing that law was essential, because the Germans were going to do what they wanted whether or not there was law in place. But they were rather respectful of the law, and that's partly why we see so much law. So Giorgio Agamben, he's an Italian philosopher. He's written a very influential book called Remnants of Auschwitz, The Witness in the Archive. And he argues, and I've kind of adapted this from his ideas, that we see a series of transformations taking place, and law paves the way for these transformations. So the non-Aryan is transformed into the Jew. That is, they're robbed of their citizenship by law. They're no longer a German citizen. And the Jew passes into the deportee. That is, having been robbed of citizenship, they are able to be sent east to the various concentration and extermination camps. Upon arrival, the deportee becomes the prisoner, an inmate in a concentration or an extermination camp. And the prisoner, of course, then passes into the corpse, and this is Agamben's rather confronting term, via the gas chamber. Or some other form of murder, be it starvation, brutal beating, or a bullet in the head. So, in a strange way, we could say that the genesis of ending up in a place like Sobibor or Auschwitz or Treblinka is a whole series of rather obscure and sometimes rather innocuous looking laws that are passed in the 1930s that end up basically being the building block of the final solution. Thank you.